Imagine this. You're out late at night, delivering pizzas to strangers' homes. The roads are quiet, too quiet, and the last house on your route tonight? It doesn't even show up on GPS. But the address feels wrong. The text you just received says, "Whatever you do, don't go inside." But you do it anyway. What happens next will haunt you forever. Welcome back to Mr. Not Horror, where the ordinary turns terrifying. Tonight, we've got 4 chilling true pizza delivery horror stories that will make you think twice about opening the door after dark. Before we dive into these spine-chilling tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that'll keep you up at night. And tell us in the comments, what's the creepiest delivery experience you've ever had? We'd love to hear your story. Jack leaned against the counter of the small pizza shop, scrolling aimlessly on his phone. The evening had been slow, and he was counting the minutes until closing time. His manager, a grumpy older man named Greg, hollered from the back, "Jack! Last order just came in." "You're taking it," Jack groaned, glancing at the clock. 11:55 p.m. 5 more minutes, and he would have been home. "Can't someone else do it?" he called back, but Greg was already shoving a warm pizza box into his hands. "The address is on the ticket," Greg muttered. "And don't forget to grab some extra napkins. Customers always complain about that." Jack glanced at the slip of paper. The address didn't look familiar, and when he punched it into his GPS, the app hesitated before plotting a route. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "It's hungry." "Don't take too long." He frowned, probably one of his friends messing with him. Ignoring the text, Jack grabbed his jacket, tucked the pizza box under his arm, and stepped out into the cold night. The streets were eerily quiet as he drove. The usual hum of late-night traffic was absent, leaving only the sound of his tires crunching against the damp road. Fog crept in, thick and suffocating, swallowing the glow of the streetlights one by one. The GPS rerouted twice, each time sending him farther from the familiar neighborhoods. The house loomed into view, its shadow cutting through the mist. It wasn't a house, really, more like a mansion that time had forgotten. The structure was massive, its once white paint peeling away to reveal rotting wood underneath. A single light flickered weakly near the front porch. Jack parked at the end of the cracked driveway and stared at the house. He felt a twinge of unease as he grabbed the pizza and approached the front door. The air was unnaturally cold, and every step he took seemed to echo louder than it should. He knocked once. The sound reverberated through the house. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Just as he was about to leave the pizza on the porch and text his manager, the heavy wooden door creaked open on its own. Hello?" Jack called out, peering into the darkness. The faint light from the porch spilled into the entryway, revealing dusty furniture draped in sheets. The air smelled damp and metallic, like rust or blood. He hesitated. The instructions had been clear. "Deliver to the back door. Do not knock on the front." But curiosity pulled him forward. He stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind him with a force that made him jump. "Hello?" he called again, louder this time. His voice echoed in the cavernous space. Somewhere deeper inside, he heard a faint whisper. Or maybe it was the wind. Jack's phone buzzed, startling him. He pulled it out to see another text from the same unknown number. "You're inside now. It's too late." A chill ran down his spine. His instinct screamed at him to leave, but his legs felt like they were moving on their own. The whispers grew louder, leading him to a grand staircase that spiraled downward into the basement. The pizza box felt heavier in his hands. The basement door was ajar, a faint orange light flickering from within. He hesitated at the top of the stairs, peering into the gloom below. Symbols were carved into the walls, jagged, crude markings that seemed to twist and writhe when he looked at them too long. "Just drop the pizza and go," he muttered to himself. His voice sounded small and hollow in the oppressive silence. Step by step, he descended into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, the flickering light casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. At the center of the room stood a crude stone altar surrounded by melted candles. On the altar sat another pizza box, its edges darkened and curling as if it had been there for years. Late, a voice rasped from the shadows. Glass shattered, cutting into his hands as he climbed out. He tumbled onto the overgrown lawn and sprinted to his car without looking back. He fumbled with his keys, finally starting the engine and peeling out of the driveway. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The mansion was dark, except for the faint silhouette of the creature standing motionless in the doorway. Jack didn't stop driving until he reached the pizza shop. He quit on the spot, leaving the keys to the delivery car on the counter. But the nightmare didn't end there. A few days later, Jack found claw marks on the hood of his car. Then the texts started again. "It's still hungry." One night, as he sat in his apartment, too afraid to sleep, he heard a low growl outside his window. Trembling, he looked out to see a shadowy figure standing in the street, staring up at him. The next text came moments later. "It knows where you live." Elena tightened the strings of her apron and glanced at the clock hanging above the pizza counter. It was nearly midnight, and the small-town pizza shop was quiet, except for the faint hum of the ovens cooling down. Her shift was almost over, and she couldn't wait to clock out. "Last order!" Her manager, a stocky man with a perpetually sour expression, called from the kitchen. He handed her a receipt with an address scrawled on it. "You're taking it. It's on the way home, right?" Elena frowned, checking the address. It wasn't on the way home. In fact, it wasn't familiar at all. She pulled out her phone to map it, but the GPS struggled to locate it. After a long pause, the app generated a route through an area she didn't recognize. "Seriously, Greg? This address looks sketchy as hell." "It's a paying customer," Greg grunted. "Just drop it off and you're done for the night." With a sigh, Elena grabbed the pizza and headed to her car. The box was warm against her hands, but the chill in the air made her shiver. She tossed the box onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot. The streets were eerily empty, the occasional streetlight flickering as she drove. Her GPS guided her away from the main roads and deeper into the outskirts of town. Houses grew sparser, and the trees seemed to close in on either side of the narrow road. When she reached the destination, her stomach sank. The house was large but looked abandoned, its paint peeling and its windows dark. Only one dim light flickered in the upstairs window, casting long shadows over the yard. Elena parked her car and stared at the house for a moment. She had an unsettling urge to turn around and leave, but the thought of explaining herself to Greg made her groan. "Just drop it and go," she muttered, grabbing the pizza and stepping out of the car. The gravel crunched under her boots as she walked to the front porch. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She knocked again, harder this time, and was about to leave when she heard something faint. A muffled sound. Crying? Elena froze, her hand hovering near the door. She leaned closer and heard it again. A child's voice, sobbing softly. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. "Your pizza's here." The sobbing stopped. Something about the sudden silence made her chest tighten. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but curiosity, or guilt, pushed her to try the door. It creaked open with a low groan, revealing a dark hallway. "Hello?" she called again, stepping inside. The air was icy, and the smell of damp wood filled her nostrils. Dust floated in the faint light spilling through the open door. Furniture covered in white sheets lined the room, and the walls were scratched and scuffed, as if someone, or something, had been clawing at them. The sound of faint crying echoed from upstairs again. Elena's grip on the pizza box tightened as she inched toward the staircase. "Is someone here? Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. The crying grew louder as she climbed the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. At the top, she found a long hallway with doors on either side. The crying was coming from the room at the far end, where a faint orange light flickered beneath the door. Her heart pounded as she approached. Slowly, she pushed the door open. The room was empty, except for a large antique mirror leaning against the wall. A single candle burned on the floor in front of it, its flame casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. The crying had stopped, but Elena could still feel the weight of someone or something watching her. She approached the mirror, the pizza box still in her hands. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was off. The room behind her looked different in the mirror. The walls were bare and stained, and the furniture was missing. In the reflection, the door slammed shut behind her. Elena whipped around, but the door was still open. She turned back to the mirror and froze. Her reflection was no longer moving. The mirror image of herself stood still, staring at her with wide, empty eyes. A smile slowly spread across its face, unnatural and too wide. Elena stumbled back, dropping the pizza box. The reflection raised a hand and pointed behind her. Elena's blood ran cold. Slowly, she turned around. The room was no longer empty. The walls were lined with mannequins, their lifelike faces frozen in expressions of terror. Each one was turned toward her, their glassy eyes seeming to follow her every move. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. She pulled it out and saw a notification from an unknown number. It was a photo of her standing in the room, surrounded by the mannequins. Her breath hitched as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. Something was coming up the stairs. Panicking, Elena grabbed the candle and bolted out of the room. The hallway stretched longer than before, the doors on either side disappearing into the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until she could hear a low, guttural growl behind her. She ran down the stairs, nearly tripping over her own feet. The front door wouldn't budge when she tried to pull it open. Desperate, she turned and sprinted toward the living room, where a large bay window offered her only escape. The growling was right behind her now, accompanied by the sound of nails scraping against wood. She didn't dare look back. Grabbing a chair, she hurled it at the window, shattering the glass. She climbed out, ignoring the sharp pain as shards cut into her hands and legs. When she reached her car, she threw herself inside and locked the doors. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The house grew smaller in the distance, but something caught her eye. A figure stood in the upstairs window, watching her. Its outline was faint, but she could see enough to know it wasn't human. For days after, Elena couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She swore she saw shadows moving in the corners of her vision, and her phone kept buzzing with texts from the same unknown number. "We're not finished." One night, while lying in bed, she heard a faint tapping at her window. Gathering her courage, she pulled back the curtain. A mannequin's lifelike face stared back at her, its glassy eyes unblinking. The night was bitterly cold, the kind of chill that seemed to seep into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Sam adjusted the heater in his old beat-up car, sighing as he waited for the next delivery to come through. It was his first week on the job, and he was already questioning why he'd signed up for it. Low pay, terrible tips, and late-night drives to strange places weren't exactly his idea of a dream gig. Just as he was about to nod off, the ding of the shop's tablet broke the silence. He checked the screen. The address was on the outskirts of town, right near the old industrial district. It wasn't a place he'd ever been before, and he couldn't imagine why anyone would order pizza out there at this hour. But it was his job, and he needed the money. Grabbing the pizza, Sam slipped into his car and punched the address into his GPS. The screen hesitated, then showed a route that cut through a series of desolate backroads. He frowned. That part of town had been abandoned for years, ever since the factories closed down. Shrugging off his unease, He pulled out of the parking lot and followed the directions. The drive was unsettling. The further he went, the fewer streetlights there were, until the only illumination came from his headlights slicing through the dense fog. The industrial district loomed ahead, a graveyard of crumbling warehouses and rusted machinery. He passed empty lots and shattered windows, the silence oppressive. Finally, his GPS announced, "You have arrived." Sam slowed to a stop in front of an old, decrepit warehouse. Its windows were boarded up, and the faded sign above the entrance was illegible. A single bulb flickered weakly above the door, casting a pale, sickly glow. He double-checked the address. It matched. "Who the hell orders pizza here?" Sam muttered. He grabbed the box and stepped out of the car, the cold biting at his skin. His breath puffed in the air as he approached the door. There was no doorbell, so he knocked. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the warehouse was far larger inside than it appeared. He waited, but no one answered. He knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open on its own. Sam hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But then he thought about the crappy tips he'd gotten all week and how he couldn't afford to get on his manager's bad side. "Hello," he called out, stepping into the dimly lit space. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of rust and mildew. The main room was vast, with broken machinery scattered like forgotten relics. Overhead, the remnants of a skylight allowed the moonlight to filter in, casting eerie shadows on the floor. "Hey, your pizza's here," Sam's voice echoed, but there was no response. As he moved further inside, he noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols carved deep into the brick, some of them smeared with what looked like dried blood. His heart began to race, but he told himself it was probably graffiti. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding him, growing louder and more insistent. "Is someone here?" Sam called out, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. The whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse. Sam placed the pizza box on a nearby table, deciding he'd done enough. He turned to leave, but just as he reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. He froze, his breath hitching. Slowly, he turned back to the room. The warehouse was no longer empty. Figures stood in the shadows, barely visible but unmistakably there. Their forms were wrong, elongated limbs, heads tilted at unnatural angles. They didn't move, but Sam could feel their eyes on him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, making him jump. With trembling hands, he pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have come." The figures began to move, their bodies jerking and twisting as though they were struggling to control their own limbs. The whispering returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a language Sam couldn't understand. Panicking, he backed away, his eyes darting around the room for an escape. The only other door was at the far end of the warehouse, half hidden behind a pile of debris. Without thinking, he bolted toward it, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. As he ran, the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, reaching for him. He tripped over a piece of machinery and hit the ground hard, the pizza box sliding across the floor. When he looked up, one of the figures was standing over him. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a smooth expanse of pale flesh. It crouched down, its head tilting unnaturally as it studied him. "Leave," it hissed, the word barely more than a breath. Sam scrambled to his feet and sprinted for the door, throwing it open and bursting out into the night. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. As he drove away, his hands shaking on the wheel, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The warehouse was dark, but he could see the figures standing at the entrance, watching him. The next day, Sam called his manager and quit. He didn't bother explaining why. For weeks after, he had nightmares, dreams of shadowy figures and endless whispers. One morning, he found a pizza box on his doorstep. He hadn't ordered anything, and the logo on the box wasn't from his old shop. Inside was a single note. "We're not done with you." The rain came down in relentless sheets, hammering against the windshield of Jack's car as he drove through the deserted streets. The wipers struggled to keep up, squealing with each pass, but he could barely see more than a few feet ahead. He was exhausted. It was his fourth delivery of the night, and he still had another 2 hours left on his shift. He glanced at the receipt on the passenger seat. The address was far out in the countryside, past the edge of town. He sighed. He hated these rural deliveries, especially in this weather. The GPS had already warned him the drive would take at least 20 minutes, and he couldn't help but think about the creaking suspension on his old car. Still, the job was a job, and tips were better the further out he went, usually. Jack turned off the main road and onto a narrower, unlit street lined with dense trees. The rain made the shadows dance across the road, and he felt a pang of unease. The drive dragged on, the road growing rougher with each passing mile. The GPS finally announced, arriving at destination, but all Jack could see was a muddy driveway leading into the woods. He frowned, slowing to a stop. Peering into the darkness, he saw a faint glow in the distance, a house hidden deep among the trees. "This better be worth the tip," he muttered, grabbing the pizza box and stepping out into the rain. The driveway was little more than a dirt path, quickly turning to mud under the downpour. His shoes squelched with every step as he trudged toward the house. The glow grew brighter, revealing a small, weathered cabin. Its windows flickered with the warm light of oil lamps, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Jack knocked on the door, shifting uncomfortably as the rain soaked through his jacket. For a long moment, nothing happened. He knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of a pale face. A woman peeked out, her wide eyes darting to the pizza box in his hands. "Did you order a pizza?" Jack asked, raising his voice over the rain. She nodded, but didn't say anything. Instead, she pushed the door open further, revealing the rest of herself. She was thin, almost skeletal, and her clothes hung loosely on her frame. Her hair was long and unkempt, dripping wet, as though she'd just come in from the rain herself. "You can come in," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Jack hesitated. Something about her made him uneasy, but the rain was coming down harder, and the warmth of the cabin was inviting. He stepped inside, glancing around. The interior was sparse but clean. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the flickering light cast long shadows across the room. The furniture was old but well-maintained, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and herbs. The woman took the pizza box from him, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice still barely above a whisper. "No problem," Jack replied, already edging toward the door. "You, want to pay cash or card?" Her eyes flickered to him, then to a corner of the room where a small table sat. On it was a neat stack of cash. "It's all there," she said, gesturing toward it. "Take it." Jack frowned but walked over to the table. The money was damp, as though it had been left out in the rain. He counted it quickly. More than enough for the pizza and a generous tip. "Thanks," he said, stuffing the cash into his pocket. "Have a good night." He turned to leave, but something made him pause. A strange sound, soft but unmistakable, came from behind one of the closed doors at the back of the cabin. It was a low, wet, gurgling noise, like someone struggling to breathe. Jack glanced at the woman. She was staring at him, her face pale and drawn. "You should go now," she said, her voice suddenly firm. Jack nodded, his heart pounding. He reached for the door handle, but before he could pull it open, the gurgling noise turned into a low, guttural growl. The door at the back of the cabin burst open. Something came out, something that didn't belong in this world. It was hunched and twisted, its skin a sickly gray that glistened in the firelight. Its eyes were sunken pits of black, and its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. Jack froze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The woman screamed, grabbing a poker from the fireplace and swinging it at the creature. "Run!" she yelled, her voice piercing through the haze of Jack's terror. The creature lunged at her, its claws swiping through the air. She managed to strike it once, but it barely seemed to notice. Jack didn't wait to see what happened next. He yanked the door open and ran into the storm, slipping and sliding in the mud as he sprinted back to his car. The rain blurred his vision, but he didn't dare stop. Behind him, he could hear the woman's screams, mingled with the creature's guttural roars. When he finally reached his car, he fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking violently. He started the engine and tore down the driveway, not caring about the potholes or the mud spraying up against the windows. As he drove, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, but in the faint light, he saw the creature standing in the doorway, watching him. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and for a moment, he thought it smiled. Jack didn't stop driving until he was back in town. Even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. He quit his job the next day. For weeks, he avoided that part of town, but the memory of that night stayed with him. Sometimes, late at night, he swore he could hear that same low growling noise, faint but unmistakable, just outside his window. And every time it rained, he dreamed of the creature, of its glowing eyes and jagged teeth, and the way it seemed to smile as it watched him run. It was one of those nights when everything felt off. Mike, a seasoned pizza delivery driver, had learned to trust his instincts, but work was work, and the bills didn't pay themselves. His shift was almost over when the order came in, a delivery to a house deep in the woods, far from the usual suburban neighborhoods he serviced. He frowned at the address. It wasn't in the system, and his GPS struggled to pinpoint it. After a bit of digging, he found it listed as part of an old rural route, well outside the town's limits. He sighed. The manager's instructions were clear. Take every order, no matter how remote. Mike grabbed the box, hopped into his car, and started the drive. The pizza smelled delicious, the aroma filling the small space, but it did little to calm his nerves. The route took him out of town, past rows of darkened houses, and onto a narrow, winding road lined with towering trees. The further he drove, the more isolated he felt. The GPS eventually led him onto a dirt path barely wide enough for his car. The rain from earlier in the evening had turned the ground into a slick mess, and his tires skidded as he navigated the uneven terrain. The headlights barely penetrated the dense fog that had settled over the woods, and every shadow seemed to shift and move. Finally, the house came into view. It was an old Victorian-style home, its peeling paint and sagging porch giving it an air of abandonment. The windows were dark, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb above the front door. Mike parked the car, leaving the engine running, and grabbed the pizza. The air was heavy and still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. He approached the porch, the wooden steps groaning under his weight. Knocking on the door, he called out, "Pizza delivery." No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Hello? Your pizza's here." Still nothing. Mike's hand hovered over the doorbell, but it looked broken, the wires dangling loosely. Frustrated, he was about to turn back to his car when the door creaked open, revealing a sliver of darkness inside. "Hello?" he called again, peering into the void. A faint voice responded, barely more than a whisper. "Come in!" Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, pushed him forward. He stepped inside, the air instantly colder than it had been outside. The house smelled musty, like damp wood and decay. "Where should I put this?" Mike asked, holding up the pizza. The voice came again, closer this time. "In the kitchen." He glanced around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but the house seemed empty. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked with every step. He found the kitchen at the end of a short hallway. It was eerily clean, the countertops bare except for a single candle burning in the center of the table. Mike set the pizza down, glancing over his shoulder. "That'll be $25.95, he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. Silence. Then, footsteps. They came from upstairs, slow and deliberate, each creak of the floorboards sending a chill down his spine. "Hey, your pizza's here," he called out, louder this time. The footsteps stopped. Mike's heart pounded as he backed toward the front door. Just as he reached the hallway, the footsteps started again, faster now, descending the stairs. He turned to run but froze in his tracks when he saw a figure at the top of the staircase. It was a man, tall and thin, his face hidden in the shadows. His posture was unnatural, his head cocked at an odd angle as though he were studying Mike. "Leave," the man said, his voice low and guttural. Mike didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the door, but as he reached it, it slammed shut in his face. He yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The man descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice now filled with a strange, almost mocking tone. Mike turned to face him, his back pressed against the door. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. I'm just delivering pizza." The man didn't respond. Instead, he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. Then the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness, and Mike's breathing grew ragged as he fumbled for his phone. He managed to turn on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the blackness. The man was gone. Mike swung the light around, his hands shaking. The hallway was empty, but the sound of footsteps now came from all around him, upstairs, behind him, even from the walls. A voice whispered in his ear, so close he could feel the breath on his neck. "You can't leave!" Mike screamed, spinning around, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in, the house itself alive and watching. Desperate, he ran toward the kitchen, hoping to find another way out. The window above the sink was small, but it was better than nothing. As he reached for it, something grabbed his arm, cold, skeletal fingers that wrapped around his wrist with impossible strength. He turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, its face a twisted mockery of a human visage. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth opened to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Mike yanked free, smashing the flashlight against the figure's head. It staggered back, letting out an unearthly scream that seemed to rattle the very walls. Without thinking, he climbed onto the counter and forced the window open, squeezing through just as the figure lunged for him. He landed hard on the wet ground outside, his body trembling with adrenaline. Scrambling to his feet, he sprinted to his car, his shoes slipping in the mud. As he drove away, his tires kicking up gravel, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent and dark, but in one of the upper windows he saw the faint outline of a figure watching him. Mike didn't stop until he reached the safety of the pizza shop. He quit on the spot, refusing to explain why. For weeks he couldn't sleep, haunted by nightmares of the house and the man with the too wide smile. One night he woke to find a pizza box on his doorstep. Inside was a single note, written in shaky, uneven letters. "You left too soon." As Mike's scream echoed through the night, the house fell silent. The cold, oppressive air hung heavy, thick with the weight of something sinister. He struggled to breathe as the shadows closed in, but before he could move, everything went black. The next morning, the pizza shop received an unexpected delivery. The same old car that Mike had driven sat abandoned in the parking lot, the keys left dangling from the ignition. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The manager looked around, wondering where Mike had gone. He tried calling, but there was no answer. The car had been there for hours, but Mike was nowhere to be found. At the same time, in the darkened house at the edge of the woods, the door creaked open. The man, the one with the twisted grin, watched from the shadows, his eyes gleaming with an unholy light. His smile widened as he saw the pizza delivery driver was gone. The house had claimed another. For weeks, rumors swirled about the disappearance, but the house remained standing, unsettled, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to drive too far. The strange, unsettling whispers continued to echo from the woods, telling of those who disappeared in the night, never to be seen again. And the pizza shop? It was just business as usual, with no one speaking of what happened to Mike. But sometimes, late at night, if you're unlucky enough to drive near that forgotten road, you might still see the faint glow of a flickering light in the distance. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faint sound of footsteps, and a voice whispering, "You can't leave."